At the end of the last session, Steve, we were talking a little about the way in which Isaiah encourages a continuous and, over time, a long interpretation of the original oracles of Isaiah. And Isaiah himself seems to have been involved in this kind of interpretation, which sets the pattern for later generations. And it continues certainly all the way down into the New Testament period. They're reading this material, and they're entering into this great interpretive tradition that was started by the prophet.
Yeah.
And it continues all the way into the modern period. One, if we had time, could track this long history of the interpretation of this book, which seems to be what the writers of the book originally intended for us to do. So the next section we're going to take up begins to talk about Assyria and the role of a foreign king in determining Israel's destiny. This is a really unusual idea because it turns out that God is personally involved in this kind of activity. So do you want to say a little more about that? Where does this idea of using the foreign king as an agent of some sort, where does all this come from in the Isaiah tradition?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned this, Bob, because the means of God using all of these different instruments or agents in this book is absolutely fascinating, and there's quite a number. As we push through this series, we're going to see all sorts of figures and nations and individuals being used as the tool or instrument or agent of God, and to just try to understand what's going on is quite interesting, and to try to see ourselves in the role of some of these agents is interesting. Certainly, the community of the second Isaiah thought that it was well worth considering how this nation of Assyria, which was this militaristic, hubristic, violent superpower, could possibly be used by God in God's purposes. And just reading some of this material in chapters 10 through 12, it really becomes clear how arrogant and how full of themselves this nation of Assyria was. It's one of the things that 2nd Isaiah is very clear about, is that because God, in the view of Isaiah, is this lofty, transcendent being of otherness, any human pretensions to power and arrogance and hubris are just ridiculous. And because Assyria encapsulates that, they come in for judgment. So the question gets raised, well, how can God both use this power as an instrument but also judge it at the same time? It's really very, very interesting. The second Isaiah has a comment on it in verse 12 of chapter 10. Amidst all this poetry, there's a little prose editorial work, and they talk about the work of the Lord with Assyria being completed. It's the language of God having this plan, this long-range view, because God is transcendent, because God is outside of the cosmos, because God is the creator, because God is totally other than what we are. God has this ability to see the long-range, widescreen drama of history, and these agents, like Assyria, have very limited and circumscribed roles. They can't destroy God's people, for example. A line in the sand is drawn before Zion, before Jerusalem. Verse 12 says, "It will be when the Lord has completed all God's work on Mount Zion, then Assyria's going to get their punishment." So one thing that emerges is, okay, the people of the Lord may go through some very rough times. The water can come up to the neck. But God has a plan, and that plan involves never letting them go under, never letting them go down. Certainly for people today, a word of comfort that God will never let God's people be dragged under so that all breath is lost.
Yes, it is a word of comfort, but it raises another traditional theme of the second Isaiah, and that is the notion of the remnant. The people who survive are the remnant, and that is a characteristic notion in Isaiah, that the people will never be wiped out. Ultimately, the idea of the remnant seems to go back to the idea of the promise to Jerusalem that it will never be destroyed. This arises in 2 Samuel 7, where Nathan the prophet gives an oracle of reassurance to David and promises that his dynasty will be an eternal dynasty and that God will choose the city of Jerusalem in perpetuity. And eventually this was transformed in Israelite thinking into the idea that the city itself would never be captured. So there is an implicit promise to the people that there will always be this remnant in Jerusalem. But the important thing to notice about it is that the remnant, as Isaiah thinks about it, does not get off the punishment.
Yeah.
In order to be a part of the remnant, you need to go through the punishment.
Yeah.
They are the people who are sitting there with the water of the Assyrian invasion rising until it's up to their necks. They're barely able to keep their heads above water. The memorable image that already is introduced in chapter 6 in the initial call vision is that this is like a forest which has been cut down. The remaining wood and the stumps have been burned.
Yeah.
But there will, from the stump, come up this little sprig of new life. One gets the impression that it is really not much fun to be part of Isaiah's remnant.
No, I think that's exactly right. And when you get to this beautiful passage about the stem of Jesse that we all sing about in Advent, this coming of this messianic sprig that's going to push itself up in chapter 11, it really does presuppose this theology of a remnant. It's not like the tree is growing strong and all of a sudden it bears new fruit. It's a stump. The people of God have been through some awful trials. They've been through an awful torrent of flooding judgment. But out of that, there's this tremendous new life that's going to burst. Interestingly enough, it's not the promises to David. It's not the Davidic royal line that's the subject of this messianic oracle in chapter 11. They go back to Jesse, David's father, as if to say, we're really going back to the roots. We're really almost digging underground to find the holy seed way back beyond everything that David and his children ever did.
Does that indicate that they're already having some doubts about the longevity of the Davidic line when this is reinterpreted?
I think you have to struggle with what one imagines the Messiah is. If you imagine that the Messiah is just an affirmation of human royal pretensions, if you imagine that the Messiah just means the vindication of David's claims to power and all that the kings in David's line did, then yeah, I think they really need to rethink that, because the God of this material renders all human claims and pretensions ridiculous. I think they're really trying to get back, when they're looking at this remnant, to just a new spirituality. They're wrestling with that. And part of that new spirituality is just a new way of being God's vicar on earth. This is a person who isn't judging by what his eyes see. He is not working by the normal patterns of power and administration in the world, but something much more intuitive, something that cares much more about the poor, something that's willing to give the self a back seat and to be centered on others, concern for the neighbor, concern for the whole community, even the weakest among them. In some ways, it is a critique of traditional royalty, traditional messianic thought. I think it's a new vision of what it would mean to have a Messiah and what it would mean to have a remnant organized around this Messiah.
So ultimately we can look forward in the rest of the book probably to ideas about how that transformation is going to take place and what the new Messiah, the new royal personage is going to be.
Yeah, I think we should all keep our eyes open for exactly that.